Yeah, I'd like to introduce Beatrice Gibson. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone. Did I just do that? Whoops. Well, thanks for coming. And thanks Remenders for this morning. That was great. I'm actually going to say very little because I'm going to show an extract from two things in progress. I'm not going to read actually. The lovely Sarah Jones is going to read because I've got a little two-in-one problem that makes me need the toilet every 20 minutes. So sorry about that, but hopefully Sarah will be. And actually it's really nice for me to hear it as well, so it's a pleasure. But yes, I'm going to, there'll be an extract from a book that I'm currently working on, a publication, and also an extract from a film, which is a rough cut. So no grade, and haven't done the sound mix, and in a bit of a mess, but hopefully that's interesting. And both things are sort of very much about their own process, both implicitly and explicitly. So I don't want to double up and explain it here, except for clarity's sake, just to say that I'm interested in musical modes of production and how they relate to filmmaking and scripts in particular. And so these two things that I'm going to show you, this project, which has been a 2-year project, which actually Jesse's been very involved in generously, orientate around and come out of a score written by Cornelius Cardew in 1967 called The Tiger's Mind, which is the only narrative and character-based score that he wrote, and it has 6 characters in it. The tiger, the mind, the wind, the circle, the tree, and a girl called Amy. Is that 6? Yeah. So Will Holder and I, who you might know, who's an editor and typographer, about 2 years ago set up this sort of collective project in which we invited 6 participants to come and be part of trying to use this score to produce both a book and a film. So I'm going to show you these things in progress. So I just hand over to Sarah, and sorry if I have to go for a pee.
B, can we go back to the beginning again? Shall we go back to the beginning when the public arrives and you say so, B? Can you go back to the beginning again? You want to script it. No, it's a good idea to go back to the beginning and it might be helpful for the public. Let's do a rehearsal. Alex, where were you going to say? Where were you going to say? Well, it's just I'm still bothered by what happens to, like what the difference in terms of product is between a book and a script, and that they are both coming out of a score, another type of prescriptive device. And I'm still bothered by the notion of taking of our voices, and on the one hand representing them as text or doing fiction, and on the other hand potentially scripting all that as something to be learned by other people or ourselves or by you. So can you talk more about that? Because in Paris we had this conversation and Alex said, but I thought we were making a book. Yeah, I never realised that you were going to make a film. Well, it's not something that was preconceived. Lots of logistical things fell into place, and it seemed to me to make sense for a film to potentially come out of this process. But that definitely doesn't mean in the same sense or using the same methodology that I have with previous films, i.e. taking verbatim scripts and re-performing them, let's say. In fact, I would really like to change that methodology. But I mean, the idea of the script was, of course, always inherent in the whole thing, because I've always been thinking about scores in relation to scripts, not really in relation to novels or simply words in print, but specifically in relation to the script as a form of print. But I'm very open to what that means and to the very expanded definition of that. And for me, these conversations are all about expanding those definitions. So throwing in words like film, well, it's all a very open process. That's all I'm saying. I have to say, reading the well, maybe it's something to do with the turning the camera or the process back onto it. Or maybe it's something to do with turning the camera or the process back onto myself and my own community and feeling uncomfortable or unconfident about that. But I have to say that as it stands right now, I think this transcript would make a terrible film. It'd be awful. I think what we're discussing, the topics of conversation in my mind, I mean, Goddard said it, all you need for a film is a girl and a gun. So I think all this right now, it wouldn't make a great script. It would have to go somewhere else entirely to be anything close to something filmable for me. It would have to get nearer to, well, to tiger's mind, actually, for me. But as the circle, then are you directing us towards that, towards what you think should be saying or doing? Well, no, I don't think it's as literal as that. I think it's more this motion, what I was talking about, like when I read the edit of chapter 1, or what we now call in day piece. I can feel very concrete personalities and relationships emerging, and those might become material for a script, not necessarily, okay, so we are just inspiration, I'm being facetious, but it feels like anything I say, you are going to be facetious. First, there was the issue with the recording and capture of your speech, which I'm not even particularly planning, but now also, if I suggest taking it somewhere more fictional and just be in the circle on my own, in my own studio, with film as my instrumentation, then that's also a problem. No, it's not a problem. I'm not trying to rile you. It's just I feel like you know, there are two different activities, and there is one that we're all involved in and that we're working towards, and that we are very conscious that this is becoming printed matter. But I mean, are we all supposed to be simultaneously aware that this is becoming a film? And how does that trouble? What are we doing? And we are part of the process, or is that something that we are outside of? Because there is also this issue in terms of, because you know this is Beatrice Gibson and Will Holder's project, right? So again, are we, us and Celine in absentia? We are not part of the editing process of the book or the document, so what part? Again, what are we in the terms of the collective? Do we just become characters? I mean, I'm fine with all this. I just think when you talk about character and fiction and all these things, maybe now is the time to get a little bit more clear about what we really mean. Totally, I agree, but I don't have the answers to that yet, which is why I gave the talk that I did, and to provoke that conversation in many ways, and it's something that Will and I discussed a lot during the edit of the first chapter of the day piece. What is the role of, like, why isn't this collectively edited, for example? It's a good question, why isn't it? And should the next chapter be sent to someone else to edit? What's clear is that all these things needed to be voiced and to be addressed. No, it's definitely, I mean, I was very uncomfortable with chapter 1 as document because it starts with me and I'm setting out a scene for how the following 32 pages are read, and I'd rather not do that, or at the moment I feel like that does contradict the nature of this situation, but on the other hand I know that it's what I'm good at and what I can do, and if it's produced using a score, if it's descriptive or prescriptive, then it might be helpful, and on the other hand I feel that we are not rehearsed and developed enough as a group of people for something else to be able to do that, for you to edit the next 16 pages. I have a sense that some kind of collective agreement, of some kind of consensus of how it could be done, could be developed. Sorry, I missed what you said. I was just talking about my responsibility, or how uncomfortable I was with doing that, whereas at the same time it feels like the whole thing that can be done through taking responsibility as not as Amy but as Will Holder. Yeah, well, you know, I was just thinking, I mean, this question is really at the heart of my films. It's just that here, within the context of my community, I think that plays out very differently somehow. And I'm really fascinated by how it's going to resolve itself in this context, or even just rear its ugly head. I mean, I just think for me, not everything goes without saying. Not everything you bring to the group or to the table is necessarily part of the final document. And I do think that we have to share the responsibility in terms of being a bit more emphatic in terms of what you want to be there. But if that can take place here, I think it could be a better practice at its decided live. Yeah, I mean, say, just to put a little pressure on, yeah, come on then, say something interesting, develop an argument. Well, I would phrase that differently and say, tell me who you are, tell me who your characters are, which is what I'm trying to unearth through suggesting the topics for discussion that I did in the email, and through raising the notions of character, so you know, on the one hand, as a fictional thing or a person created by an author, and on the other as a typographic inscription on a page, a symbol to represent speech. So I was interested in the relationship or the entanglement between those two meanings, and in the idea that the typographic inscriptions that we make on the page are produced in our characters, or that our characters might actually emerge as a result of these actual physical and material inscriptions. Yes, so the idea of a character or a series of characters emerging through being typographically laid out. And I was thinking about that in relation to both Wind, the Pinter abstract that you put on the table, and Mind, the Dickens thing you said about, oh yeah, the characters assuming autonomy, telling him what to do. Exactly, so this idea that, especially in relation to the making of a script, the idea of characters in the making, or in the writing, or in the editing, of characters becoming sounds that we track, that tell us what to do. Oh, hello, come in. Hello, hi, I'm Jessie. Alex, I. And that's John Tilbury playing the keyboard in the kitchen. So I'm not sure how much you know. I mean, I assume you know this. Yeah. So we are in the middle of trying to produce a book using this score, and that is a very open situation right now. And one of the things we were discussing earlier, in fact, was how to deal with you, with the public, which we didn't really resolve apart from we were going to go back to the beginning, weren't we? Yeah, we were asking questions about Beatrice and the circle, which is her assigned character. So I play, there are 6 characters, and I play the circle. We are all more or less assigned characters in Stuttgart. So in going back to the beginning, which was Beatrice Gibson and the circle, what is the difference between the two, or how you identify the role in relation to authorship? As in, what's the responsibility to Beatrice? No. As in, what's the relationship between Beatrice and the circle? Yeah, I suppose. Well, I don't know. I thought so much about who the circle is, I'm not sure I know who Beatrice is. I don't think there is any distinction between the circle and Beatrice. I think that the circle just becomes an excuse for me to think more formally or more rigorously about my role is this setup. About what my role is in this setup, an alibi, another alibi basically, it just becomes a structure through which to think about what it is that I'm doing already, and also, not necessarily to do the same thing. John was talking about Cardew, always talking about not self-expression being a horrible individualistic idea, but about self-invention. So maybe trying to use the character of the circle to push me to do different things, but also at the same time I have to start from who I am. So are you playing a similar character to yourself repeatedly, or are you what as in a celebrity playing their own? No, I'm just thinking about actors who stay close to themselves and actors who deliberately distance themselves from the characters they play. I don't know I've never played anyone before. I did when I was 11 in a school play. I played a carrot actually, but I don't have experience of playing anyone, so perhaps if I played people repeatedly, I would take an approach. But this is the first time I really play someone, because I think I really identify with the wind, in how the wind is described as well, not personally, but in the way I make the work as well. But in the way I make work as well. It always responds to things in its way, and it's formed by the things it passes through. And so what it is about circle that asserts you, Beatrice Gibson, as author, what is it about the circle and the character that makes you director? Well, that was what I was talking earlier, about what I perceive to be the formal qualities of the circle as a sort of framing device, essentially in the way that Cardew describes the circle in the school, as something outside time and as something that people are struggling against. If outside to get in, if inside to get out, and structure as structure. Because the circle that you showed in Memoriam, it's a score by Bob Ashley in the shape of a circle. That was a structure to allow something to happen. For me, maybe I interpret it wrongly, but for me it was also about a potential infinity of possible iterations. This idea that it's constantly looping back on itself again and again and again, and that, as such, it's sort of like self-reflexive portrait of its own structure, of its own conditions. Of its conditions. I just thought you made it quite obvious that that was a straightforward directorial metaphor for someone who is presenting an equation, if you like, or a system which you are asking a player or actors to work within and to relate to each other. And that particular piece, has the further advantage that it is that it is literally a visual representation of an astrolabe. An astrolabe is for navigation. It's in order to determine navigation whilst at sea. It's circular, but it's of course how to find the best straight line. It's giving direction. So it has vectors. It has north, east, south, west. It's something which is giving direction to the players. In that sense, it's a great metaphor for circle. Well, the idea that its document or its own process was also the thing that interested me. You know, that its form is its content, that the two are not separate, that relates to my own circle or how I've been trying to interpret the circle. I've been trying to interpret the character of a circle. So I spoke earlier about approaching the circle, not as a kind of personality to unearth, unfix or decode in the manner of saying X is really Y, or the circle is really this person, but rather as a set of formal qualities with the idea that those qualities are its personality, let's say, and with the idea of embodying those formal qualities as I perceive them, so its shape and its form. So yeah, in that sense I spoke about the circle as a kind of framing device, the self-reflexive element, so in other words, the author or narrator, delusional perhaps, but you know, basically as the character that is concerned with the overall shot, the POV, as you'd say in filmic terms, which of course is always something positioned relation to the audience. So I'm just wondering what, because you know you've created a context here, like you said earlier, using your peers, and as you said, that's a very different social group from your previous films, and there were particular ethical questions, and there were particular ethical positions in relation to that social group, and I'm just wondering what the issues were with the group you worked with before, say around voyeurism, inclusion, about fetishisation, and I just don't see those reverberating here so much. So you do think there are ethical questions in relation to this social group, and do you think they all revolve around authorship? I'm just wondering what the ethical issues are, and I don't know. Well, there is the issue of taking a piece by Cornelius Cardew and putting it, you know, by Beatrice Gibson. It's your piece now. Yeah, which is strange. Like I said before, there's a kind of infinite regress of authorship, because nobody has ever done that before in the history of approaching experimental scores. David Tudor never took authorship of Cage's variations, even though he could have. I mean, nobody has ever done anything. I mean, nobody has ever done that before, so now you have. I mean, nobody has ever done that before, so now you have don't it. But I'm not a musician, I'm an artist, which I think is quite a crucial difference. Yeah, but Merce Cunningham did variations as well. I mean, there is other people that have done these pieces that are not musicians, so it's quite a step. What it does mean, I mean you. I mean, you are the first person to do it. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it's really powerful to do exactly that. But then Jesse's question really becomes an essential question, because I mean it. What's the first thing on the page, the first thing you see? And it's also the first thing throughout the entire piece, top of the page, from the top down. And so what is it? You know what I mean? I think it does something in the same way that we're working together collectively to construct. I think it's potentially an extremely positive direction in which to take this. I mean, yeah, there are some really stupid reasons why it hasn't been done, but I think there are also some really important reasons, because it relates to the form of a book and publishing. But there is, and it's not even about copyright, it's about 19th century romanticism and the idea that we can't get beyond it, you know, about about the idea of singular author and the composer as transmitter. You know, he is the thing between God and us, but you know you're coming in and sweeping that aside, or troubling it because Cardew is still there. I mean, I've interpreted the circle as an author within the score, or line in its edge, as a fictional construct, so I mean it's still Cardew, who is ultimately the author. And I think that's maybe a more interesting position, remaining as author within the collective setup, or within the fiction, rather than asserting myself as an author outside of it. Maybe there's something really key in there that I haven't quite verbalised, articulated, something to do with an author within a fiction rather than an author outside of it. Can I just ask the question of what it is exactly that you think of as fiction? Well, I think of the Edit of Day piece as fiction very much. I think it's an absolutely fictionalised version of it's not a clean or honest representation of what happened point by point, line by line, in its reordering and in its restructuring. In its reordering and in its restructuring, I think it's pretty much entirely fictional. So in relation to Day piece or the Edit of Day piece, I think the way I understand fiction is quite simply really as a sort of device for editorial framing or a device for verbal arrangement, as a means of shaping speech that is attentive to its own form. I'm interested in the spatial features of fiction, I suppose, in its bringing together of voices within a landscape or characters on a page, and also the way in which it rearranges or reorders a practical field. I mean way in which it reframes reality essentially, and as such produces it. I just wanted to, if John spoke earlier about the fact that all music is interpretation, all music is in a state of interpretation all the time. It's in production, and that we are also acknowledging that, or at least in my mind, we are acknowledging that the collective that is implied in the production of music is one that's different. The collective production that is implied in music is different from an artistic production. And I think that is why we are in this situation dealing with a musical score. And I also agree with Jessie that maybe interpretation is a better word than fiction, but it's not a noun, an interpretation. I'm just wondering, is there any fictional music? And is that simply music that hasn't been performed yet? Yes, film music, laughter. Well, no, musica ficta is a term. Yeah, yes. And actually, what's interesting about music ficta is, again, it's this issue of the copyist. Musica ficta is what's attended to the copy by the copyist. Annotations, you mean? It's like annotation, but it's more than that because it's really what you hear when you read it. So in other words, it's the inclusion of accidental ornamentation, sometimes even the changing of notes, because you know in modal music, when things ascend, they have one logic. When they descend, they have another. So the pattern changes, but it includes local performance practice. So it really localises. Music ficta is also what gives you a sense of geography. Sorry, I'm a bit confused, I don't get it. So it's annotations on a musical score, a conventional musical score, accent, tone and in section. Are not in the source, so the source would be the composer's original. So it's interpretation, in fact, by the copyist. It's added in, and it's oftentimes in a different colour. So it'll be red annotation, or it'll be, it'll be a different hand. So if it's typeset, it'll be written literal translation of which is musical fiction, musical fictions, I guess. But this whole question of the interpretation of music is a can of worms, because people say, we all say, we're all kind of, I suppose, as judgmental. A Beethoven sonata, for example, we say, we like that or we don't like it. Why do we like it? And then we start talking about, well, what do we talk about what Beethoven meant? I mean, it gets very complex. Take all the references, for example, to the French Revolution in the 9th century, which have all been ironed out now, which nobody thinks about, but that was quite important at the time. He put those in for a reason. It's quite military, some of it, the final part of the symphony, so it's very difficult, I think. It's very difficult, I think, but you can't say that's your opinion, that's the easy way of dealing with it. But if you don't, then you are backing one interpretation against another. It becomes very difficult. I like Schnabel, I don't like Kemp. Well, what are you saying? Are you talking about yourself? Are you talking about the piano? Are you talking about the edition? I mean, all kinds of things. Actually, Schnabel, who is one of the most famous interpreters of Beethoven, he wrote in his edition how he played it. So he would write accelerando, diminuendo, staccato, every detail of how he played it, a megalomaniac in a way, and that's musica ficta. Yes, and it's very extreme. Yes, and it was very extreme. We would call it editing now. Like Pisoni addition of bark, same kind of thing. I mean, it's weird. It's full of dynamics which don't exist. So you are adding in things that don't exist. I think you have to stay cool about that because that's in the nature of it. But it's a can of worms, and in the end, perhaps there is an element of subjectivity where you come from, where you're coming from. That's what makes it more interesting. I see fiction as more a stimulation to both interpretation and subjectivity, like a pinprick to begin that process. As long as you can understand that the conditions are fictional, yes, and for me, what I find really interesting is that you can equate fiction with form, because I don't. I think of fiction in relation to content. I really think that fiction in relation to a narrative and being led to or stimulated or provoked. I think thinking about it in terms of form comes from a specific methodology in terms of making films. The films that I've made, in that I deal with, let's say, real situations which I document and then I edit and order. So I fictionalise them through framing them in a way that doesn't quite match how they actually were. So I suppose that equation for me comes through that process. But yes, I guess it's strange. But I suppose it's also because I think about fiction in relation to language. I think of fiction as a specific way of saying or speaking that is maybe more poetic or attentive to poetics. I think there is a word that we have skirted around, in fact. I think we haven't mentioned it. We have been very close to mentioning it, but we haven't. And that is the word imagination. And I think above all, the tiger's mind, that is what is written for. It's a challenge to the imagination. And I think the thing about analysis and interpretation, these kind of approaches, ultimately you come up against a brick wall. With imagination, there is no brick wall. And that's why I think, I think of Cardew, I think of Blake, imagination above reason, the beat poets, all that kind of. That's something which I think we mustn't lose track of. That word, the idea of imagination, which is so important when we actually come to deal with it. How do we use our imagination, which we actually have to do in the interpretation of this work? I remember Cornelius in the book. There is one point when he is very dogmatic in his Stalinist way. He says, "It's nonsense. How can you turn an elephant into a pint of milk?" Well, actually, in the imagination you can. All the fairy stories, Alice in Wonderland, all the great stories are full of elephants being turned into pints of milk.
Thank you so much. I feel like I put you through hell. So it was really difficult to read because it's a transcript of a conversation. It's sort of polyvocal, but it's essentially delivered as a monologue. And so it's hard to read. But thanks for doing that. So I'm going to show you the sort of next stage of that project, which is this film that I've been working on. This project, The Tiger's Mind, was over a sort of 2-year period, and it was constituted by a series of week-long conversations using this score. And at a certain point in the process, I got very fed up with words, and I tried to think about how I might make objects speak to each other instead of words. So I invited all the participants to, you can see why, it's very wordy. But so I invited all the participants to produce the different production elements of the film kind of in character. So it was sort of like a maybe disastrously utopian collective experiment, and not disastrously utopian, but it definitely was quite a fraught process for me, and the film tries to deal, I suppose, with the failure of it, which is personal to me. I think everybody experienced it very differently. But, so I'm going to shut up and just play you a bit. Yeah.
The tiger fights the mind, been at it ever since the first clay tablet set, and seeks relations while heedless in for their changing while doing. That loves the circle. Electric vitality, quite contrary. Ideally, we think so much alike that traps the tiger.
I don't remember when the voice began, but it seemed like it wasn't mine. This is what happened. In the beginning, there were 6 of us. The props, sound, the special effects, the music, the narrator, and the author. And now they're dead. In the beginning, it was just about trying to learn to speak better or differently, to speak together, in a way that might be more beautiful, make more use of the tongue, sound more like music. She might have said we were looking for a revolution in language. That would have been typical of her. I would have said more like loitering in its suburbs. He would have interjected, can a comma really save the world? This is what happened. Very soon language became intolerable. Words filled even our dreams and sought out the remotest corners of our lives with their monotonous drones. What made me recoil from words were feelings. I wanted an emotional life. This is what happened. I suggested another kind of language. The language of things. The language of shapes, surfaces, and wide screens. I suggested speaking through objects in glass. The film became the landscape of those things. The thing made up of those things. The remnants of a conversation.
Lost in tiger's eyes to hide the presence of abstraction, nonsense, and silence, and get close to information without touch.
I don't remember when the voice began, but it seemed like it wasn't mine. This is what happened.
Sorry. So yeah, that's it. Thanks. Halfway through.
Oh yeah, just stopping halfway through.
Yeah.
We're going to show the whole thing in a couple of weeks. So.
Yeah, sorry, it's an illicit showing.